The restaurant buzzed with the soft clinking of silverware and the gentle hum of conversation. It was one of those fancy places where the chandeliers sparkled a little too brightly, and the waiters walked around like they owned the place. Among them was a young waiter, sharp-tongued and full of himself, who prided himself on knowing exactly who mattered and who didn't. That's why, when she walked in, he barely spared her a glance. She wasn't dressed in designer clothes, didn't have an expensive handbag, and certainly didn't look like she could afford the restaurant's overpriced menu. Her simple outfit and quiet demeanor made her an easy target. He smirked, already deciding she wasn't worth his time. With a forced smile, he approached her table, holding the menu with just 2 fingers as if it might taint him. "Are you sure this is the right place for you?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "Our menu is a bit upscale." The woman looked up unfazed. Her expression remained calm, but there was something in her eyes, something unreadable. She didn't argue, didn't snap back. Instead, she simply nodded and reached for the menu. The waiter sighed dramatically. He had dealt with people like her before, dreamers who thought they could just waltz into luxury without paying the price. He decided he'd make it clear she didn't belong. He took his time ignoring her, prioritizing other customers, and making her wait unnecessarily long before even bringing a glass of water. The entire time, he shot her little looks, as if waiting for her to take the hint and leave. Yet she didn't. She sat there, patient, observing. When she finally placed her order, he raised an eyebrow. "That dish is one of our most expensive ones," he said, his voice laced with doubt. "Just making sure you're aware of the price." The woman simply smiled. "I am." Annoyed, he rolled his eyes and walked away, muttering something under his breath about people wasting his time. He made sure her food came out later than it should have, placing it down with a fake smile that barely hid his irritation. As she ate, he whispered to another waiter, chuckling at his own cleverness. "Watch, she'll struggle to pay. I see it all the time." But then, something happened. A group of well-dressed individuals entered the restaurant, their presence commanding immediate attention. The manager, usually stiff and expressionless, suddenly sprang to life, his face lighting up in recognition. He rushed to greet them, shaking hands and nodding enthusiastically. Then, to the waiter's shock, the group headed straight for the woman's table. His smirk disappeared. The once dismissive look in his eyes was replaced by growing unease as he watched the interaction unfold. The manager, who barely acknowledged his own staff most days, now stood before the woman with a nervous energy, speaking to her with the utmost respect. And then, the words that sent a cold chill down the waiter's spine. "It's such an honor to have you here," the manager said, his voice filled with admiration. "If we had known you were coming, we would have prepared properly." The woman simply nodded, placing her napkin down and turning slightly, her gaze landing directly on the clueless waiter. And in that moment he knew. He had made a terrible mistake. This setup builds tension, intrigue, and makes viewers eager to see what happens next. Want any tweaks or a different approach? Here's the next part of your story. The waiter's stomach twisted as he stood frozen, his mind scrambling for an explanation. Who was she? Why was the manager acting like she was someone important? His heart pounded as the woman met his gaze, her expression calm, unreadable. The people around her were clearly influential, polished, confident, the type who carried themselves like they owned the world. The restaurant, which had moments ago felt like his territory, now seemed completely out of his control. He watched as the manager bent slightly, his tone shifting into something almost apologetic. "Would you like us to move you to a private dining area?" the manager asked, his voice carefully measured. The woman shook her head, glancing briefly at her barely touched plate. "No need," she said. "I was just finishing my meal." The waiter's fingers clenched at his notepad. He needed to figure this out before it was too late. He had treated her like she was beneath him, but clearly, she was someone important. Someone powerful. One of the men standing near her, An older gentleman with a sharp suit and an air of authority turned toward the waiter. His gaze was cold, calculating, like he was assessing someone unworthy of his time. "Is this the service you provide to all your guests?" he asked, his voice slow, deliberate. The waiter felt a sharp prickle of fear crawl up his spine. He struggled to find his voice. "I didn't realize," the woman lifted a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "It's all right," she said, her tone even. "I'm used to it." "Used to it?" The words hit him harder than any accusation could. His mind reeled. He had judged her the second she walked in, assuming she didn't belong, that she wasn't worth his time. And now, standing in front of her, surrounded by people who clearly respected her, he felt something close to shame creeping in. The restaurant had fallen into a strange silence, the kind that came when people sensed something big was happening but weren't sure if they should get involved. A few other staff members had gathered nearby, their curious eyes darting between the woman and the waiter. They had seen how he treated her. They had smirked along with him, laughed at his jokes about her. Now they were watching, waiting to see how this would play out. The woman took a slow sip from her glass of water before setting it down carefully. She finally turned her full attention to the waiter, her gaze steady. "Tell me," she said, her voice light but carrying an undeniable weight. "How long have you worked here?" He swallowed hard. "A little over a year," he admitted, shifting uncomfortably. She nodded, as if that told her everything she needed to know. "And in that time, how many people have you treated the way you treated me today?" His throat went dry. He wanted to protest, to defend himself, but he couldn't find the words. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "I don't expect an answer," she said. "I already know." The waiter's face burned with embarrassment. He wasn't used to being on this side of the conversation. Usually, he was the one in control, deciding who got good service and who didn't. But now, it was clear he had been wrong. The older gentleman beside her checked his watch before looking up at the manager. "We have a meeting to get to," he said. "Shall we?" The woman stood, smoothing out her simple outfit. She looked nothing like the other guests in the restaurant, and yet, somehow, she seemed more important than any of them. The waiter watched, heart pounding, as the manager led her and her guests toward the back of the restaurant, toward the private rooms reserved for VIPs. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. He had messed up. Badly? And the worst part? He still didn't know who she was. As the murmurs of the other staff died down, the waiter turned to one of his coworkers, lowering his voice. "Do you know who she is?" he asked. The other waiter hesitated before shaking his head. "No," he admitted. "But if the manager is acting like that, she's someone big." The clueless waiter nodded, his mind spinning. He needed to find out more. He needed to understand who she was before it was too late. Because one thing was certain: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. This section deepens the mystery while keeping the suspense high. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments. The waiter felt his pulse hammering in his ears as he watched the woman disappear into the private dining area. His hands trembled slightly as he wiped them against his apron. The shift in atmosphere had been instant. One moment, he was in control, mocking someone he assumed was beneath him, and the next, the entire restaurant seemed to be looking at him like he had made the biggest mistake of his life. He had to know who she was. Moving quickly, he made his way toward the back of the restaurant, trying to keep his head down so the manager wouldn't notice. He wasn't supposed to go near the VIP section, but curiosity burned in his chest like a fire he couldn't put out. As he neared the hallway leading to the private rooms, he slowed his pace, listening. The voices inside were low but firm, the kind of conversation that carried weight. He caught bits and pieces, mentions of business partnerships, something about major investments. These weren't just rich people, they were powerful. And she was at the center of it. He inched closer, careful not to be seen, his heart thudding harder with each step. Then, suddenly, the manager's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Don't let anyone disturb this meeting." The waiter barely had time to react before one of the senior staff members stepped into the hallway, standing guard near the door. He quickly turned away, pretending to adjust the settings on a nearby table, but his mind was racing. She wasn't just some wealthy guest. She was connected to something bigger, something that made even the manager, a man who barely acknowledged his own employees, nervous and overly respectful. The waiter backed away, returning to the main dining area, but he couldn't focus. His hands were clammy, his breathing uneven. He needed answers. He spotted one of the hostesses at the front podium, scrolling through the reservation list. Taking a deep breath, he approached, forcing his voice to stay calm. "Hey," he said casually. "That woman in the private room. Did she have a reservation?" The hostess glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "Why do you want to know?" He shrugged, trying to act disinterested. "Just curious. Never seen her here before." She hesitated for a moment before lowering her voice. "She didn't make a reservation," she said. The owner called ahead and told the manager to clear a private room for her. His stomach twisted. The owner. The man who rarely even stepped foot in the restaurant. Did he say why? The waiter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The hostess shook her head. "No, but it must be serious." "I mean, have you ever seen the manager act that way before?" The waiter swallowed hard. No, he hadn't. The realization made his skin prickle. Whoever she was, she had the kind of power that made people nervous. His mind raced through possibilities. A celebrity? A business mogul? Someone connected to the restaurant's investors? But if she was that important, why had she come in alone, dressed so simply? Why let someone like him mock her without saying a word? Something didn't add up. As he returned to the floor, he noticed the other waiters whispering among themselves. They had all seen what happened. Some of them looked amused, others nervous. "She's probably some billionaire's wife," one of them muttered. "Or maybe an undercover food critic." The waiter clenched his jaw. That explanation would have made sense except for the way the manager had practically bowed to her. His eyes drifted toward the private dining area again. He needed to know more. Time passed, but the tension in his chest didn't fade. He kept glancing toward the hallway, waiting for any sign that the meeting was ending. Then, finally, the door to the private room opened. The woman stepped out first, followed by the well-dressed men who had joined her earlier. They moved with quiet confidence, their expressions unreadable. The manager walked beside her, still wearing that overly polite smile. "Please let me know if there's anything else we can do for you," he said eagerly. The woman simply nodded, then turned toward the exit. The waiter watched her closely, his heart pounding. He knew this was his last chance to figure out who she was. Then, as if sensing his stare, she paused. For the first time since their initial interaction, she looked directly at him. And she smiled. But it wasn't a warm, friendly smile. It was knowing. It sent a chill down his spine. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The look in her eyes told him everything. She knew exactly what he had done, exactly how he had treated her. And now, she was leaving him with the weight of that knowledge. As she stepped out of the restaurant, the manager let out a breath of relief. The other employees quickly went back to work, but the waiter stood frozen in place. Something told him his mistake wasn't just going to be forgotten. And he had no idea what was coming next. This section builds maximum suspense, keeping viewers hooked for the resolution. Let me know if you'd like any tweaks. The waiter stood there, his palms sweaty, his mind racing. The woman was gone, but the weight of her lingering stare hadn't faded. He could still feel it like an invisible pressure against his chest. The restaurant slowly returned to normal, the clinking of plates and murmured conversations filling the air again. But for him, nothing felt normal. Something told him this wasn't over. He forced himself to move, picking up a tray and heading toward a nearby table, trying to push away the unease creeping up his spine. Maybe he was overthinking. Maybe she was just someone rich and connected, and all he had to do was forget about this and move on. But then, the manager's phone rang. It was the kind of ringtone that made the entire staff tense up. Everyone knew the manager rarely took calls in the middle of service unless it was from someone important. And judging by the way his face paled as he glanced at the screen, this was beyond important. The waiter slowed his movements, pretending to wipe down a table nearby so he could listen in. "Yes, sir," the manager said quickly, his voice suddenly tight with nerves. "Yes, she just left." A pause. "No, I had no idea." "I understand." There was a long silence, and then the manager's expression changed into something close to horror. His eyes darted around the restaurant before finally landing on the waiter. He felt his stomach drop. The manager's grip tightened around the phone. "Yes, he's still here," he said, barely masking his distress. "I'll handle it." The call ended, and for a moment, the restaurant carried on as if nothing had happened. But the waiter knew something had shifted. He could feel it. The manager was still staring at him, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, he walked over. "Come with me," the manager ordered, his voice quieter than usual but somehow more threatening. The waiter hesitated. "What's going on?" The manager didn't answer. He simply turned and walked toward the back office, expecting him to follow. The waiter's pulse pounded as he moved through the familiar hallways, past the kitchen, past the storage rooms, until they reached the manager's small but pristine office. The door shut behind them with a quiet click, trapping him in the heavy silence. The manager turned to face him, crossing his arms. "Do you have any idea who that woman was?" The waiter swallowed hard. "No," he admitted. "But I think you don't think," the manager snapped. "You listen." The waiter stiffened, gripping the edge of his apron. The manager took a deep breath, pressing his fingers against his temples as if trying to calm himself. "That woman," he said slowly, "is one of the most influential people in this city. And he pointed a sharp finger at the waiter, treated her like she was nothing." A cold sweat broke out on the waiter's forehead. "Who is she?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The manager exhaled sharply. "She's the majority shareholder of this entire restaurant chain." The words hit him like a brick to the chest. His breath caught. "What?" The manager's glare darkened. "She owns this place. And every other location under this brand." The waiter's mind spun. The woman he had mocked, ignored, and dismissed wasn't just some rich guest, she was his boss. Technically, she was above even the manager. His stomach churned. The manager shook his head in disbelief. She didn't announce herself. She didn't demand special treatment. She walked in like any other customer, and you treated her like garbage. His voice lowered into something more dangerous. "Do you realize how bad this looks?" The waiter's throat was dry. "I didn't know that's the problem," the manager cut in. "You assumed. And now you might have cost yourself everything." The weight of those words settled heavily on the waiter's chest. He had been so confident, so sure of himself, believing he could judge people just by looking at them. And now, that arrogance had led him straight into disaster. "What's going to happen?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. The manager rubbed his temple again. "I don't know." She didn't say much. But the fact that the owner called immediately after she left? He shook his head. "That's not a good sign." The waiter's pulse roared in his ears. This was bad. Worse than bad. He had seen people get fired for far less. Then, as if things couldn't get any worse, there was a knock on the door. Both men turned as one of the hostesses peeked inside, her face tense. There's someone here asking for him," she said, glancing nervously at the waiter. His stomach twisted. Who? She swallowed. A driver. He says he was sent to pick you up. Silence. The manager and the waiter exchanged looks. A driver? The waiter's fingers curled into fists. He had no idea what was waiting for him outside that door. But one thing was clear, this wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The waiter's legs felt heavy as he stepped out of the office, his heart pounding against his ribs. The restaurant, once his familiar domain, now felt like a different world altogether. Eyes flicked toward him as he moved past the other employees, their whispers barely masked. They all knew something was happening. They just didn't know what. Outside, a sleek black car idled by the curb, its tinted windows making it impossible to see who was inside. The driver, a tall man in a press suit, stood by the passenger door, waiting. The waiter hesitated for a split second, but there was no point in stalling. He had no choice but to get in. As soon as he slid into the leather seat, the door shut with a quiet click, sealing him inside. The air was cool, the scent of expensive cologne filling the space. Then he saw her. She sat across from him, legs crossed, hands resting gently on her lap. Her face was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, something measured, like she was still deciding what to do with him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the car's engine was the only sound. Then, finally, she broke the silence. "You looked nervous when you saw the car," she said, her voice calm, almost amused. The waiter forced himself to swallow. I didn't know what to expect." She tilted her head slightly. "And now?" He shifted uncomfortably. "I still don't." A small smile ghosted across her lips, but it wasn't warm. "Good," she said simply. The car pulled away from the restaurant, the city lights blurring past the windows. The waiter's pulse didn't slow. "I suppose you've figured out who I am by now," she continued. He nodded. "You own the restaurant." His throat was dry. "And I treated you terribly." Her eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Yes," she said, "you did." The waiter clenched his fists in his lap, bracing for what was coming next. A lecture. A scolding. A formal termination. He had seen people get fired in humiliating ways before, but this was worse. This wasn't just losing a job. It was a reckoning. But then, she leaned forward slightly, her gaze sharp. "Tell me," she said. "Why did you assume I was beneath you?" He hesitated. No excuse would be good enough. But lying would make it worse. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice small. "You didn't look like you belonged there." She let out a quiet breath, shaking her head. "And who decides what belonging looks like?" He had no answer. The car turned down a quieter street, the city noise fading into the background. The tension thickened between them. "You're not the first person to judge me like that," she continued. "And you won't be the last. But what bothers me isn't that you misread me. It's that you didn't even consider the possibility that you might be wrong." The words landed like a punch to the gut. He had been so sure of himself. So certain. She studied him for a long moment before finally exhaling. "Tell me, do you like your job?" The question caught him off guard. I don't know," he admitted. She raised an eyebrow. "That's not a great answer." He looked down at his hands, shame creeping up his spine. "I guess. I never really thought about it," he said. "It's just a job." She nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." The car slowed to a stop in front of a building he didn't recognize. The driver stepped out and opened the door. The woman gestured for him to follow. His chest tightened as he stepped onto the sidewalk, glancing up at the modern glass structure in front of them. It wasn't an office. It wasn't another restaurant. It was a community center. Confused, he followed her inside. The sound of laughter and conversation filled the air. People moved around the large open space, some in business attire, others in casual clothes. A few volunteers were organizing donations, helping guests, making conversation. The energy in the room was warm, welcoming. The woman led him toward a side hallway, stopping near a glass-walled conference room. Inside, a group of young adults sat in discussion, listening intently to a speaker at the front. "They're part of a mentorship program I fund," she said. "Most of them come from difficult backgrounds. They've been overlooked, dismissed, underestimated just like you dismissed me." The waiter swallowed hard. She turned to face him fully. "The difference between them and you?" she continued. "They know what it feels like to be judged. And they work every day to prove people wrong." He felt a lump form in his throat. She studied him for a moment longer before finally giving a small nod. "I don't care about firing you," she said. "Losing your job isn't the lesson." He looked at her, confused. "Then what is?" She smiled faintly. "Perspective." The waiter stood there, letting her words sink in. All this time, he had believed he was in control, that his quick judgments were harmless. But now, standing here, seeing the reality of the people she helped, the truth hit him like a tidal wave. He had been the small-minded one. After a long pause, she gestured toward the conference room. "If you're willing to open your eyes a little, you're welcome to stay and listen." The waiter hesitated. His instinct was to run, to escape the embarrassment of his own ignorance. But then he thought about the way she had looked at him back at the restaurant. Not with hatred. Not even with anger. Just disappointment. And for some reason that was worse. Taking a shaky breath, he stepped forward. "I'll stay." She nodded approvingly before walking away, leaving him standing at the doorway. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly uncertain. Not about her. Not about his job. But about himself. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly the point. The waiter lingered at the doorway, unsure if he belonged in that room. He could see the way the people inside leaned in when the speaker talked, the way they nodded, their expressions shifting between understanding and determination. These weren't just casual listeners, they cared. They wanted to learn, to grow. And for the first time in a long while, he wondered if he did too. He hesitated, glancing down the hallway where the woman had disappeared. A part of him still wanted to retreat, to go back to what was comfortable. But comfort was what had led him to this moment, to that careless mistake at the restaurant, to the realization that he had spent so much time looking down on others that he never once looked inward. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside and quietly took a seat at the back. No one turned to look at him, no one questioned his presence, and yet, he felt more exposed than he ever had before. The speaker, a man in his 30s with a confident but kind presence, continued talking about resilience, about overcoming assumptions, both the ones placed on you and the ones you place on others. Every word seemed to hit a little too close to home. The waiter listened, at first just as an observer, but slowly, something shifted. He found himself leaning forward, his mind racing with thoughts he had never considered before. He had always assumed success belonged to a certain kind of person, the well-dressed, the well-spoken, the obviously important. But as he looked around the room, he realized how wrong he had been. These people weren't defined by their past or how they looked. They were defined by what they were willing to become. As the session wrapped up, a few attendees stayed behind, chatting in small groups. The waiter wasn't sure what he was supposed to do next, whether he should just slip out quietly and pretend none of this had happened. But before he could make a decision, the woman reappeared, watching him with that same knowing look. "So?" she asked. "Did you learn anything?" He swallowed. "Yeah." She waited, her expression expectant. He exhaled. "I think I've spent a lot of time believing I was better than other people," he admitted. "Or at least that I could tell who mattered and who didn't just by looking at them." His fingers curled slightly at his sides. "But I was wrong." The woman studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good." He let out a nervous breath. Does this mean I still have my job? A flicker of amusement crossed her face. Your job was never really the point, she said. I wanted to see if you were capable of change. The waiter wasn't sure how to respond to that. He had spent the entire day fearing he would be fired, but now, that fear seemed so small compared to everything else. She reached into her bag and pulled out a card, handing it to him. This is the director's contact information. If you're interested in volunteering here, let him know. The waiter stared at the card in his hand. Volunteering? He had never even considered something like that before. But now, standing in this space, after everything that had happened, he wasn't so sure anymore. She must have seen the hesitation on his face because she simply smiled. It's up to you, she said. But trust me, perspective is a gift. Don't waste it. With that, she walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The waiter left the building feeling different, though he couldn't quite explain how. The streets looked the same, the night air felt the same, but something inside him had shifted. The next day at work, everything felt sharper. He noticed things he had ignored before: the tired single mother struggling to keep her kids entertained at the table, the old man who always dined alone and never spoke much, the young woman nervously checking her phone as if waiting for news she wasn't sure she wanted. For the first time, he saw them not just as customers but as people. And when a woman walked in that afternoon, her clothes simple, her expression tired, he didn't make assumptions. He smiled, led her to a table, and treated her with the same respect he would have given anyone else. She seemed surprised by his kindness. And that, he realized, was the problem all along. People shouldn't have to be rich or important to be treated well. They just had to be human. As the weeks went by, the memory of that night never left him. And one evening, after his shift ended, he found himself pulling out the card the woman had given him. Before he could second-guess himself, he dialed the number. Hello? A voice answered. The waiter took a deep breath. Hi, he said. I was wondering if you still needed volunteers. A pause. Then, a warm chuckle. We always do. And just like that, a new chapter began.